Welcome back. Happy Memorial Day. Today is May 30th, Memorial Day, and several things happened on this date that I want to talk about. First of all, in 1431, this is the date that Joan of Arc was burned at the stake. Joan of Arc, the French girl who rallied her countrymen, that is France, was ultimately captured by the English and was, again, burned at the stake. Coincidentally, there's a statue of her inside Notre Dame, the church in France. There's also a statue of her in New Orleans because she was known as the Maid of Orleans, or the Maid of Orleans. So there's a statue of her there. But it was on this date that she died in 1431. On this date in 1539, Hernando de Soto landed in Florida with 10 ships and 700 men and began the Spanish conquest down there. Now, this is not to be confused with the Hernando de Soto who wrote this book, The Mystery of Capital. This is a Peruvian economist, wrote this book called Why Capitalism Triumphs in the West and Fails Everywhere Else. It's a book talking about the importance of land rights for the development of democracy. Pretty interesting book. I kind of recommend it, highly recommend it. It was on this date in 1806 that future President Andrew Jackson killed a man in a duel. The man was named Charles Dickinson, who had accused his wife of bigamy. Funny story, technically, his wife was, wait, let me look around because I will make sure there's no Andrew Jackson supporters around. She was actually guilty of bigamy. It was on this date in 1883 that a stampede on the Brooklyn Bridge killed 12 people. People were on the bridge thinking that it was going to collapse. Now, keep in mind, the bridge had only opened 6 days prior. It opened on May 24th, and then less than a week later, it was a rumor got going around that it was going to fall, and people stampeded to get off, and 12 people died. On this date in 1896 was the first recorded car crash. Now, this picture is not of that because the first recorded car crash is of a person hitting a bicyclist. So a vehicle hit a bicyclist on this date in 1896. In 1898, the Chicago Cubs traded player Max Fleck to the Cardinals for Cliff Heathcote. Now, this in and of itself is not an unusual thing, except for the fact that the trade took place between a double header between the Cubs and the Cardinals. And so literally both teams played for their respective teams in the first game. They were traded in between. They played for the other team in the second game. So that took place on this date in 1898. Speaking of baseball, it was on this date in 1935 that Babe Ruth played his final game for the Milwaukee Braves. So 1935, his last game was today. And in 1937 is the Memorial Day Massacre in Chicago. The Memorial Day Massacre in Chicago. Now, the story is that there was a big steel strike, and the lower south side of the city was kind of the center of steel production at the time. And so the city settled the strike with the largest steel company, but many of the smaller steel companies didn't want to settle. And so they had a protest, and the Chicago police moved in, and the Chicago police did what they, back in 1937, not now, what they are so good at doing, and they broke it up by shooting 50 people, hitting 10 over the head with clubs, and ended up 10 ultimately died as a result. 4 at first, and then 6 later. In 1967, the book 100 Years of Solitude was published. This is a book by Colombian writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Now, I only say that for 2 reasons. One, because this is supposed to be like one of the 100 best books ever written. And especially if you start talking about Spanish literature, they talk about Don Quixote and 100 Years of Solitude. And I just read 100 Years of Solitude about, 4 months ago. Interesting book. Interesting story. If you've read it, let me know. We can talk about it. But it was on this date in 1967 that it was published. Today is Bob Evans' birthday. I know what you're saying. Bob Evans. Well, maybe if I showed you this, it would become clear who Bob Evans is. Bob Evans was born on this date in 1918. And sadly, it was on this date in 1744 that English poet Alexander Pope died. Alexander Pope, the wicked wasp of Twickenham, The subject of this particular biography, Alexander Pope by Maynard Mack. Alexander Pope is, I don't know how they measure this kind of stuff, but it's reputedly the second most quoted English writer after William Shakespeare. Alexander Pope said such things as, "A little learning is a dangerous thing." Let's see, what else did he write? Several other great essay on man, essay on 10 censure wrong for one who writes amiss, and of course my favorite Alexander Pope quotation, one of the quotations that I use quite often: "True wit is nature to advantage dressed, what oft was thought, but ne'er so well expressed." So Alexander Pope died on this date in 1744, as did in 1778 Voltaire. The French philosopher Voltaire, another person who's great for some quotations, including something along the line of, "If you want to know who controls you, find out who you can't criticize," or something along that line, that idea. Voltaire died on this date in 1778. Finally, Milton Bradley died on this date in 1911. Milton Bradley, yes, that Milton Bradley, the one who created the games, he died on this date in 1911. All right, well, let's get back to talking about Isaiah. We're going to talk about a very kid-heavy story today. Isaiah, we're going to start in Isaiah 7, and we're going to go through to the first part of Isaiah chapter 9. Cover three chapters, 2.5 chapters, 4 kids. Let's get back to that. Good morning, welcome back. Today we're going to continue on our study of Isaiah. Now, if you remember last week, we ended at the end of chapter 6, that great passage where Isaiah sees the king, in the year the king Uzziah died, and he sees the Lord, and the Lord says, "Who's going to go for us?" And he volunteers, and he says, "Well, you're going to go, but it's going to be a big disaster. Okay, nobody's going to believe you," kind of thing. And we talked about that as being Isaiah's calling, his commission, as it were. And the first 5 chapters are sort of an indictment of where Isaiah saw the city, or saw the nation of Judah. Okay, so you have Judah in the south, you have Israel in the north. Okay, and then his commission. Now, starting in chapter 7, we get into the more traditional part of what we would call the prophecy, or the book of Isaiah. Okay, so 1 through 6 are in many ways seem to be like an introduction, and now we get into the narrative, especially 7 through 39. Okay, so as we get through 7 through 39, there's several themes that are going to come up over and over again, and we'll talk about them. One of them that comes to play today is the question of who are you going to trust? Okay, who are you going to trust? So it's an issue that Ahaz, the king, has to deal with. And then later on, at the very end of this block, when we get to 36 through 39, we'll talk about Ahaz's son Hezekiah. And Hezekiah has an option to trust as well. Okay, the short version is Ahaz fails, Hezekiah passes. Okay, so before we get into Ahaz, before we get into chapter 7, let me give you a little bit of the background of what's going on here, because the story that we read today, there's stuff going on in the background that if you only know the book of Isaiah, you're not going to know what the background stuff is, okay? And you realize that the what's going on takes on a deeper meaning, or quite a different meaning, when you know the backstory, okay? So for example, if I were to say to you, if we were talking about our houses, let's say we're talking about our houses, and I were to say something like, "Yeah, you know what, I bought a house in 2008, okay? I bought a house in 2008. Now, on the surface, all that tells you is that I bought a house 13 years ago. Okay, I bought a house 13 years ago, 2008. However, if you know your American history, and if you were around in 2008, you know that was the year of the great financial meltdown, when the credit markets froze up, when all of this stuff happened. And you know that, wow, how did you manage that? And it becomes a much different event when you realize, oh, I bought a house during 2008. Let me give you another example. If I were to say to you, if you were to ask me, "Are you a Cubs fan?" And you say, "Well, yeah, of course I'm a Cubs fan." "Well, when did you become a Cubs fan?" Say, "Oh, well, I became a Cubs fan in 2016. Okay. Or answer to the same question, "When did you become a Cubs fan?" "Well, I became a Cubs fan in 1969. Now, between the difference in years, obviously, or the length of time it's been, there's two different connotations there. If you said, this is when I became a Cubs fan, because 2016 is the year that the Cubs won the pennant, okay? And so, I became a Cubs fan in 2016, okay? So, oh yeah, great. You got on board when they were winning, okay? Both of them just say I became a Cubs fan in this particular year. But if I say I became a Cubs fan in 1969, that's that classic year when the Cubs were leading up until middle of August, and then they blew it and lost to the Mets by the end of the year. Okay, so it was that great disappointing year. And to say I became a Cubs fan in the year of that great disappointment has a different connotation. Okay, both of them say the same thing, just when you became a Cubs fan. And so knowing the background can change the details, okay, or kind of give you a richer understanding of what's going on. So let me kind of explain a little bit about what's going on here, so that when we go through chapter 7, you'll see why what's going on is significant, okay? Now, Ahaz is the king of Judah, okay? Judah is a southern kingdom, okay? Ahaz is the son of Jotham. Jotham is the son of Uzziah, okay? In the year the king Uzziah died. So Uzziah dies, Jotham becomes the king. Jotham is king for 16 years. He dies, Ahaz, his son, becomes king, okay? Now, while Ahaz is king, now Ahaz is not a good king, okay? Ahaz is an outright evil king. You can read about him and again, it's in 2 Kings 16, or 1 Chronicles 28. You can read the story of Ahaz and some of the things that he did, okay? Bad king, okay? Not a godly king whatsoever, okay? So he's the king of Israel, he's the king of Judah, and during his kingdom, during his reign, he got into a war with Israel, his northern kingdom, and Syria. Now, there's 3 countries to the north that we need to be aware of, okay? So, obviously, Judah, and north of Judah is Israel. And then north of Israel is the country of Syria, okay? And the capital of Syria is Damascus. Now, this is not the same as the country of Assyria, okay? Assyria, Assyria, okay? Syria, Assyria. Assyria, I believe, is the area now largely where Iraq is, but it's further north, or maybe north and a little bit to the east. Okay, so Assyria, the Assyrians are the big bad. They are the big superpower at the time. Actually, Assyria to the north and Egypt to the south, although Egypt doesn't really become a player. There's more of a threat, but whatever. So Assyria is the big threat. Okay. And Assyria has been quiet for a long period of time, but then a new king comes along, Tiglath-Pileser, and he gets back on the whole conquest route. Okay, but that's the big bad. But north of Judah is Israel and Syria. Now, what happens in 2 Kings 16, is that Israel and Syria get together and form an alliance, and they invade and attack Judah. And it's really, Judah gets beat, okay? And there's some stuff happens, and then but they're not done. They haven't yet really, put the coup de grace into them, okay? So Judah's still hanging on, okay? But there's been, these battles and stuff, but Israel is now aligned with Syria, and they're out to get Israel, or they're out to get Judah, okay? So Ahaz has this great idea. Okay, I need to do something. I can't, because Judah is small, okay? Judah is you take the smallest state in the Union, or like a Rhode Island, or something, Vermont, Judah is small, okay? All of Israel today is smaller, is about the size of Indiana, the state of Indiana, physically, And so and Judah is just like 1/6, 2 out of 12 tribes, okay? So Judah is a small country, and they realize they can't beat back these guys, and so they need some help. And so Ahaz has the great idea, hey, I'm going to pay Assyria to come down and attack from the north, and that will distract Israel and Syria. And so then, and of course, because I'm in league with Assyria, then Assyria will be nice to me, okay? and this will get this Syrian Israel threat off my back. Okay, and so he does that. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit more. I'll expand on this a little bit more when we get to chapter 9. Okay, but that's what's going on in the background. Okay, so Ahaz has this threat of Israel and Syria going to attack. Okay, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? Okay, now beginning in verse 7. Okay, chapter 7. Let's get back into it, and I'll fill in a few more details as we go. So in chapter 7, verse 1, in the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, son of Uzziah, king of Judah, Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, the king of Israel, came up to Jerusalem to wage war against it, but could not yet mount an attack against it. Okay, and I think what they're referring to here is that they haven't yet been able to culminate the attack. Okay, they haven't been able to, because we know from 2 Kings that they do. Ultimately, there's an attack that's made. Okay, so we don't know exactly whether, or it could be that this is before that first attack. Okay, so again, we don't know where these events fit within that whole story. That's one of the problems that we've got. We have to just kind of speculate, okay, where this fits in. So it could be that this takes place before the very first attack, although that first attack comes, okay? So Ahaz has this problem. When the house of David was told Syria is in league with Ephraim, the heart of Ahaz and the heart of his people shook as the trees of the forest shake before the wind. Okay? All right, so here, the more I think about this, the more I'm thinking, yeah, this is before the first attack even takes place. And Ahaz is worried. Ahaz is worried. The house of David, just kind of another way of mentioning the ruling family, the ruling house, which, as we mentioned, would include Isaiah. Okay? Tradition says Isaiah would be the king's cousin. Okay? Or, kind of along that line, cousin once removed, something like that. Okay, so they're shaking. They're like, wait a minute, these guys are massed on the border and they're coming to get us. What am I going to do? Okay, so they're worried. And the Lord said to Isaiah. Now Isaiah has been in ministry for at least 16 years. We know that because he gets into ministry at the latest at the death of King Uzziah, and Jotham is the king for 16 years. So he's been a prophet for 16 years. So no doubt at this point he's well known. And so the Lord comes to Isaiah and says, listen, I want you to go say something to Ahaz. He says, go out to meet Ahaz, you and Shear-Jashub your son. So take your son with, Shear-Jashub. Okay, now Isaiah's got some great names for his kids. Okay, Shear-Jashub means only a remnant will remain. Now this is interesting, how, and you see this a lot in the Old Testament, that the names meant something. Okay, that there were phrases that you would name your kid things. So Isaac, the name means laughter, because Sarah laughed when the angels, and this is in the story in the book of Genesis 12, 15, somewhere in there, that the angel said, you're going to have a child, and she laughed. And when she did conceive and have a child, they named the child Laughter. Okay, so the Lord said to Isaiah, go and meet Ahaz, and bring your son, Shear-Jashub, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool on the highway to the washer's field. Now, a very specific location, and part of this is thinking that he's there because he's looking for water supplies. He's expecting a siege, because up at this point, Israel doesn't have an independent water supply. Now, this is something that Hezekiah, Ahaz's son, takes care of, fixes. But at the moment, they don't. And so that's kind of the assumption. But basically, it's like, this is where he is. Go talk to him. It says, go out and meet Ahaz and say to him. Now, this is the message that the Lord tells Isaiah to give to Ahaz. Be careful, be quiet, do not fear, and do not let your heart be faint because of these two moldering stumps of firebrand at the fierce anger of Rezin in Syria and the son of Remaliah. That would be Pekah from Israel. Because Syria with Ephraim and the son of Remaliah has devised evil against you, saying, let us go up against Judah and terrify it, and let us conquer it for ourselves and set up the son of Tabeel as a king in the midst of it. Thus says the Lord God. So Isaiah is making it clear to
Ahaz, listen, I know and the Lord knows what the threat is. Okay? I know what the threat is. And he says, here's what the Lord says. It shall not stand and it shall not come to pass. Okay, there you go. Right? So Isaiah the prophet, he's got 16 years of experience. He goes to Ahaz, he says, listen, this is what you're worried about. I'm telling you, the Lord says, it will not come to pass. End of story, right? Well, who are you going to trust? For the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin, and within 65 years, Ephraim will be shattered from being a people, and the head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is the son of Remaliah. So really what you're seeing here are two predictions, two prophecies. Number one, this immediate threat is not going to happen. And secondly, within 65 years, neither Ephraim, that is Israel, again, there's a lot of this using, I think that's a synecdoche where you use one to represent the whole. The northern kingdom and Syria aren't even going to exist within 65 years. Now, that's an odd number, 65 years, okay? And I don't know why they picked that particular number, except to say that it's clearly to Ahaz, not in your lifetime, okay? So he's saying, look, the immediate problem that you see is not going to happen in your lifetime, but long-term, in your child's lifetime, these guys aren't even going to exist, okay? So he tells them this. Now, this is speculation. I think it fits within the text. So I think at this point, Ahaz has not committed to the alliance with Syria. Okay, so he has a choice. He's like, I can trust God. I can say, whoa, that's it. God said it. I believe it. That settles it, right? Actually, it's God said it. That settles it. I believe it. But whatever. He says, okay, that's it. I'm done. Ahaz, not so much. Because see, I think Ahaz at this point has got his plot. He's figured this out, how he's going to do it. All right. Again, the Lord, I'm sorry, and it shall not stand. And he said at the end of verse 9, if you are not firm in faith, you will not be firm at all. And I think this is just Isaiah's way of saying, believe me, trust me. Okay? Trust God, or if you want to get relief, trust God. Okay, so this is an opportunity for Ahaz to trust. Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz. Now, it's interesting here in chapter 7. I don't think that you've got a situation where, and this is a typical pattern that you see in the Old Testament, where sometimes you have a prophet and you have a recipient of a message, usually a king, but not always. And the Lord tells the prophet, this is the message I want you to give to him or her, as the case may be. So the Lord says to the prophet, go to the store. And so the prophet tells the recipient, go to the store. And then when it's written, it's just written, the Lord said to him, go to the store. Okay, so again, Isaiah is there serving as the intermediary, but in the writing of it, he's just reporting, this is what the Lord said. Now, he said it through me. I'm the one that did the talking, but the Lord said to Ahaz, okay? So the Lord spoke to Ahaz, ask a sign of the Lord your God. Ask a sign. You don't believe me? Ask a sign. Ask a sign. Let it be as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven. He's like, try me. Try me. Go ahead. Try me. Okay? But Ahaz said, I will not ask. I will not put the Lord to the test. Okay? This is, now what he's doing here is as Oswald put it, he's hiding behind piety. No, I'm not going to put the Lord to the test. Why not? If the Lord comes up and says, hey, test me. Ask for a sign. Okay? Why wouldn't you just say that? Why wouldn't you just say, okay, well, make it rain at 2:00 or something? Just something to be a sign. Okay? Gideon had no trouble, and we're going to get to Gideon later. Gideon had no trouble demanding a sign. Others wanted signs. The Jews and the Pharisees all through the Gospels have no trouble asking for signs. Here, the Lord is telling Ahaz, ask for a sign. Whatever you want, ask for a sign. Ahaz says, no, I'm not. I will not put the Lord to the test. Now, This is Ahaz's big test here. Are you going to trust the Lord? Okay. And notice what he says here. Ask a sign in verse 11. Ask us, this is the Lord. Ask a sign of the Lord your God. Ask a sign of the Lord your God. Go ahead. Try me. And he said, now in verse 13, beginning in verse 13, now Isaiah comes and steps into the picture. Okay, because Ahaz has flunked. He has failed this trust test. Okay, and he said, hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to worry men that you worry my God also? Do you see the shift there? Used to be your God, now it's my God. Some look at this and think, okay, this is it. This is the point that doomed Judah. That had Ahaz stood firm, it wouldn't be there. That you worry my God also? So ask for a sign. Oh, no, I'm not going to go. Okay, fine. You think you're playing with me? Okay, I tell you what, I'm going to give you a sign. And here's what the sign is going to be. Now, this is in verse 14. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. You're not going to ask one? I'm going to give you a sign. Okay? Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. He shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the boy knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land whose two kings you dread will be deserted. Now, have you ever heard that passage before? Okay. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Okay, a lot of stuff here. This is, of course, one of Isaiah's greatest hits. What is going on in this particular passage? Okay, a couple of things. First of all, the word there, virgin, okay? Now, in Hebrew, there's a particular word. There's a very specific word for virgin. And I'm going to try and keep this as, rated G as I can, okay? There's a particular word for virgin, okay? There's a particular word for a young woman of marriageable age who 99 times out of 100 in the Jewish community at that time is going to be a virgin. And there's a word for a married woman. Okay, so virgin, there's the Hebrew word for virgin, there's a Hebrew word for young woman of marriageable age, there's a Hebrew word for married woman. Okay, the word that is used in the Hebrew here is not the word for virgin. It is the word for a young woman of marriageable age. And so one idea, and again, this is speculation, although it fits the facts, okay, is that Isaiah is a prophet. He has he's been married in the past because he's got a son, okay, but now he's a widower. He's anticipating marriage, okay, he's anticipating remarriage, and Isaiah is a member of the family, okay, so Ahaz would probably know that. And so the point that he's making when he and Ahaz are talking about this, Isaiah is saying to him, look, here's the sign. The sign that Isaiah gives to Ahaz is not that the woman is going to have a child. That's not the sign that Isaiah is giving the woman, or that the Lord is giving the woman through Isaiah, or the Lord is giving Ahaz through Isaiah. The sign is that this woman, this young woman of marriageable age, the implication is she's not married. The implication is that someday she will be, that she is going to have a child. And before that child reaches a certain age, a very young age, knows the difference between right and wrong, Israel and Ephraim will be off the map. That's the sign. Now, this has to be a legitimate sign. Otherwise, Isaiah is just blowing smoke here. Okay? Because he says the Lord is going to give you a sign. All right? Now, if we look back at this, and again, now in Matthew 1:23, this is, of course, used when they look back and say, oh, wait a minute, this has a broader meaning, and that's great, and I'm not arguing that point. Okay, we look at it that way and say, oh, it had to be, okay, it didn't at the time. Okay, or we say he was just talking about Christ. Okay, well, then you've got Isaiah just spouting off these weird things out of the blue for no reason. Okay, so most scholars look at this and commentators look at this and say, okay, no, he's making a legitimate thing. Because again, it isn't necessarily miraculous. The miraculous part is not that the woman is going to have a child. Okay, that she's going to conceive and have a child. It's that by the time the child reaches a certain age, that child will, or that Ephraim and Israel and Syria will have gone away. Okay, from before the, okay, and then now verse 17, there's a shift here. Okay, basically, since you won't trust me, here's what's going to happen to you. You had a choice. I had to give force this sign on you. The Lord will bring upon you and upon your people and upon your father's house such days which have not come since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, the king of Assyria. Okay, that is, what's going to come on you? The king of Assyria. Wait a minute, this can't be right, because the king of Assyria is going to be my friend. Okay, the Lord is saying, no. It's not going to work out like you're thinking it is. Either you thought maybe the commitment is already there, maybe he's just thinking about it. It's not going to work out the way you think it's going to work out. In that day, the Lord will whistle for the fly that is at the end of the streams of Egypt and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. And they will all come and settle in the steep ravines and in the clefts of the rocks and on all the thorn bushes and in all the pastures. In that day, the Lord will shave with a razor that is hired beyond the river with the king of Assyria, the head and the hair of the feet. So like a complete devastation here. And it will sweep away the beard also. In that day, a man will keep alive a young cow and 2 sheep. And because of the abundance of milk that they give, he will eat curds. For everyone who is left in the land will eat curds and honey. Okay, a little benefit to the remnant. Okay, think about the remnant. Okay, and going on talking about the devastation that's going to come to Jerusalem, to Jericho, to Judah. Okay, now again, Ahaz has this figured out. Ahaz could have just trusted God. Ahaz could have said, oh, great. Ahaz could have said, wait, the Lord says it's not going to happen? Great, let's go watch the Cubs. But no, Ahaz is like, no, he's like, no, I'm not going to test you because I got this figured out. I don't really need God's confidence now. And I think there's a lesson you could go there. Here's a guy that had God saying, test me. And Ahaz says, no, I got to figure it out. How does that usually work out in your own life? When God says, I can do this for you, and you go, no, I got this all figured out, okay? In that day, every place where there used to be 1,000 vines worth 1,000 shekels of silver will become briars and thorns. With bows and arrows, a man will come there, for all the land will be briars and thorns. And as for all the hills that used to be hoed with a hoe, you will not come there for fear of briars and thorns. But they will become a place where cattle are let loose and where sheep tread. Okay, so this devastation is coming. Now, chapter 8. Isaiah's going to take it to a next level. Then the Lord said to me, take a large tablet and write on it in common characters. Don't really know what he's saying, but I think the implication is write this so people can understand it. Okay, actually the literal phrase here is like with a what is it? The stylus of man, or with common characters so that everybody can understand it. Okay, belonging to Mahar Shalal Hashbaz. Okay, this is a name, Mahar Shalal Hashbaz, which if we'd had a third child, this would have been the name, Mahar Shalal Hashbaz. But the name itself means speeding to the plunder, hurrying to the spoil. Again, which is sometimes what we call one of our sons. Hey, come here, speeding to the plunder. But whatever. Belonging to this person. Okay. And then I will get reliable witnesses, Uriah the priest and Zechariah the son of Jeberechiah, to attest for me. Okay. So again, he's like, okay, go get these guys, write this statement about this child's name, and then get these witnesses. Now, why does the Lord need witnesses for what's about to happen? Well, I think the reason he wants these witnesses is because he wants to document Ahaz's failure. Maybe if it had just been Ahaz, nobody would have ever heard about it. Okay, but now with these priests, everybody's going to realize, hey, wait a minute, Ahaz really messed up here. Okay. And I went to the prophetess, and she conceived and bore a son. Okay, now it's easily and within the realm of the language that Isaiah's wife is referred to as a prophetess, because either wife of a prophetess, or she is a prophetess in her own right. Okay, and then I went to, her, and a child arrived. So this child is Isaiah's second child, at least his second child. So we know we have Shir Jashub, only a remnant will remain. And now we have speeding to the plunder, hurrying to the spoil. Okay. They went to the prophet, and she conceived and bore a son. The young woman will conceive and bear a son. Okay. Chapter 7, now chapter 8. Okay, so again, Isaiah says, listen, the woman's going to have a child, and by the time he's, again, so most look at this and say, okay, this is the fulfillment of the immediate prophecy to Ahaz in chapter 8. And I went to the prophet, I'm call his name, Maher-shalal-Hashbaz. For before the boy knows how to cry, my father or my mother, the wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be carried away before the king of Assyria, which is exactly what he promised in chapter 7. Okay? The Lord spoke to me again, verse 5. Because this people has refused the waters of Shiloah that flow gently and rejoice over Rezin and the sons of Remaliah, okay, this is, it's kind of tricky trying to figure out what they mean by rejoice over. And most people think these guys are it could mean either are in league with them or rejoice at the idea of their destruction. I like the idea of being in league with them. Because the people has refused the waters of Shiloah that flow gently, therefore, verse 7, behold, the Lord is bringing up against them the waters of the river. And usually in the Old Testament, when they talk about the river, they're talking about the Euphrates. So essentially, what is being said here, the Lord said, look, I offered you a nice, casual creek, river that would have helped you. You refuse. So I'm going to bring this huge monster river, and it's going to come in, and it is just going to destroy you. And it will, verse 7, therefore, behold, the Lord is bringing up against them the waters of the river, mighty and many, the king of Assyria in all his glory. Okay, so what is he saying here? Okay, basically it's this. Hey, Ahaz, Assyria isn't going to stop with Israel and Syria. And it will sweep on into Judah and will overflow and pass on, reaching even to the neck, and its outspring wings will fill the breadth of your land. Oh, Emmanuel. Interesting. Suddenly here comes this word, oh, God with us. Okay. Now, why does he use this? Okay. Is he referring to Maher-shalal-Hashbaz? Perhaps. Is he referring to the Messiah? Or is he just looking at it, and is he using the phrase as a prayer? God be with us. I think that's it. Now, again, it's not clear what it is. That might be it, because if you look to the next passage, because now suddenly he's shifted, and now the prophet is talking to these countries. Okay? Be broken, you peoples, and be shattered. Give ear, all you far countries. Strap on your armor and be shattered. Strap on your armor and be shattered. So, go ahead. Come on. Ultimately, it's not going to work out for you. Now, there's going to be a lot of destruction, and there was a lot of destruction if you look through 2 Kings and you read that story there. Okay? But it's going to be a lot of destruction. Take counsel together, but it will come to nothing. Speak a word, but it will not stand. Okay? Why ultimately isn't Assyria going to win? Ultimately. Why isn't they? Because it's the end of verse 10. For God is with us, Emmanuel. Okay. Again, now the Lord is talking to Isaiah. Now this is an interesting passage here. This is like my favorite verse in Isaiah right now. Okay, my favorite passage in Isaiah. Now imagine what's going on here. Okay. Judah feels threatened. Okay, the people of God feel threatened by political and military forces that are out of their control, and they're looking for an explanation. They're looking for a way to understand what's going on. How do we describe it? How do we explain it? How do we rationalize it? How do we make it make sense to us? Now, through Ahaz, they've already rejected God's interpretation of events. And what did the Lord tell Isaiah in chapter 6 about his message? Keep preaching it, and they're not going to believe you. They're not going to believe you. They're not going to believe you. So what are they doing? How are they explaining it? Okay. For the Lord spoke thus to me, okay, this is to Isaiah, with his strong hand upon me, and warned me not to walk in the way of this people, saying, I think this is my New Life verse, do not call conspiracy all that this people calls conspiracy, and do not fear what they fear, nor be in dread. Okay? Do not call conspiracy what these people call conspiracy. And do not fear what they fear, nor be in dread. I think the interesting thing here, and this is something very typical in all of our lives, they looked at the situation and they saw a problem. Okay? It's a legitimate problem. Okay? But the thing is, it's not the real problem. That the obvious problem is not the real problem. And had Ahaz taken made the sign and gone with it, it would have been the real problem would have been solved, taken care of, and that would have taken care of the obvious problem. Okay. How many times have we done that? The obvious problem, the real problem. Okay. Are we dealing with the obvious problem, or are we dealing with the real problem? Okay. Are we putting on a fire, or are we taking care that the fire doesn't start in the first place? Okay. So they're just trying to explain it. So-and-so's in league with so-and-so. Okay. Does this sound familiar? I mean, have you been in any country recently where the people of God get all bent out of shape over what's going on, and they start looking at all of these different, coming up with all these different conspiracies? Does that sound familiar at all? I'm reading this and I'm going, whoa, how come none of the guys that I heard preach or talking about, God's working in various elections ever quoted this verse? Okay, why not? Well, I'm telling you, this is, again, I may go to political rallies, I may get a sign that has this verse on it and just hold it up kind of thing. But again, an amazing verse. And it's like, here, we're in a situation where maybe the things don't look good. But you know what? Is it the real problem? Is it the obvious problem? Because what is the real problem? Well, Isaiah's going to tell him. But the Lord of hosts, him you shall honor as holy. Let him be your fear. Let him be your dread. If you do this, then verse 14, and he will become a sanctuary and a stone of offense and a rock of stumbling to both houses of Israel, Judah, a trap and a snare to the inhabitants, and many shall stumble on it. They shall fall and be broken. They shall be snared and not taken. What does the New Testament say about, the gospel, the scandalon? It's a stumbling block in 1 Corinthians. We preach Christ a stumbling block to the Jews. Okay? Verse 16, bind up the testimony, seal the teaching among my disciples. Now, some have looked at this and said, okay, this is Isaiah saying, that's it. I'm backing out of this public ministry. I'm going to just talk to my disciples. Others look at this, and I like this idea. It's like, this is Isaiah's command here. I'm going to write this stuff down. I'm going to start making notes on this stuff, because nobody's going to believe this 20 years from now. Okay. Bind up the testimony, seal the teaching among my disciples. I will wait for the Lord, who is hiding my face from the house of Jacob, and I will hope in him. Who are you going to trust? Now, we're going to come back to this thing much later in Isaiah 40, verse 31. They that wait upon the Lord. Okay. Behold, I and the children whom the Lord has given me are signs and portents in Israel from the Lord of hosts, who dwells on Mount Zion. So the children, Isaiah is saying, the children I've given are signs, which kind of makes you think, okay, well, Shear-Jashub went with him to reassure Ahaz that a remnant will be there. And if I was going to name the kid, I should. Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz is like the sign that he is going to be, by the time he's at age, this is going to have gone away. And behold, I and the children, and then he says, and when they say to you, inquire, and Isaiah is talking here, when they say to you, inquire the mediums and the necromancers who chirp and mutter. Tradition was that's how the gods, small g, talk, chirp and mutter. Should not a people inquire of their God? Yeah, it makes sense. Should they inquire the dead on behalf of the living? Okay, well, within that context, yeah, it makes sense. But he says in verse 20, to the teaching and to the testimony. Listen to what I've been telling you. To the teaching and to the testimony. If they will not speak according to this word, it is because they have no dawn. Okay? They will pay, and this is the cost. This is, again, going back to this devastation that's going to happen. They will pass through the land greatly distressed and angry, and when they are hungry, they will be enraged and will speak contemptuously against their king and their God and turn their faces upward. And they will look to the earth, but behold, distress and darkness, the gloom of anguish, and they will be thrust into thick darkness. But, verse 9, there will be no gloom for her who was in anguish. So those who were suffering, looking at the the remnant perhaps. In the former time he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the latter time he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. Okay, and this is just talking about this area. This Galilee is in the northern area of Israel. This would have been the first place taken over, and in fact it was the first place, because it makes sense. If you're coming in from the north, the northern cities are going to go first. Okay, this has got nothing to do with Galilee and Jesus being from Galilee. That's not, it's just a coincidence, same town. Okay, but he says at some point they're going to come back and they're going to be replenished. The people, and now we have this interesting passage. Okay, not chapter 9, 2 through 7. Okay, because now it seems like Isaiah has put himself in the future and he's looking back on this. So before he was here looking here, now he's here looking back. Okay, and what does he say is going to happen? The people who walked in darkness, those who were in the gloom, have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. You have multiplied the nation, you have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, for they are glad when they divide the spoil. Okay, so God has come in and done something, and the people are rejoicing over this. Okay, so he's looking, because it hasn't happened at this point, so I think he's put himself and he's looking back on something that's going to happen. I don't know, this is a kind of a weird tense, but you know, by this point I will have done this. By this point this will have happened, or something kind of thing. Present, perfect, progressive, I don't know, something weird. For the yoke of his burden and the staff of his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor you have broken, as on the day of Midian. Okay, now again, I mentioned Gideon earlier. Gideon fighting the Midianites. If you remember that story, they started with thousands of soldiers, and then they went down to, if you want to leave, and now we're down to 10,000, I think was the number. And then they went down to the river, and the Lord said, look, just watch how they drink, and if they drink right, and this is in Judges 6 through 8, they drink right, they keep them, and he ended up with 300 soldiers against this huge army, and guess what? It was a great victory with a very small force. Judah's a very small force. And Isaiah is saying, look, God is going to do for Israel, for Judah, just like he did with Midian, just like he did with Gideon. For every boot of the tramping warrior in battle tumult, and every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for the fire. Okay, every garment will be burned. This is Judah's and the enemies, both sides. Remember back in chapter 2, where he said they're gonna, not gonna study war anymore, and they fight their battles or turn their swords into plowshares. This is what's going to happen, and what's going to bring all of that about? Verse 6: For to us a child is born, to us a son is given. Heard this verse before? And the government shall be upon his shoulder. Okay, tell the truth. How many of you are singing the song right now? Hand up. Okay. And his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and the peace there will be no end. On the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice, with righteousness, from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. Okay? Another one of Isaiah's greatest hits. Okay, now here's the thing. A traditional Jewish interpretation of this passage would look at that verse, look at that passage and say they're talking about Hezekiah. Okay, that verse is fulfilled. Now traditional Jewish interpretation would say, yeah, that's a prophecy of the future, but it's of Hezekiah. And Hezekiah is a very, very, very good king. He does a lot of good stuff. Okay, he worships God, he follows God, he listens to Isaiah, he trusts God, he tears down the high places. A lot of these things, and in some ways you can look at the way they talk about kings, they look about, how they talk about rulers, and you could say, well, yeah, okay, I can kind of see that, And so Jewish believers or Jewish interpreters would look at this and go, oh, yeah, that's Hezekiah. Hezekiah is the king. Now, it doesn't quite work as far as the timeline goes, based on the whole story, to be Hezekiah. But I mean, again, timelines are not as cut in stone. And so there is a possibility. It's not unheard of that this could be what they're talking about. But I think what happened is, because Hezekiah was a great king, Manasseh, his son, was a terrible king. I forgot the name of this king of Ammon, I think, and then Josiah, who was a super great king. But even then, Isaiah was doomed. And again, we're going back to, it might have been at this moment when Ahaz refused to trust God. Okay, but I think when they got into into the exile, and he started looking at this passage, and people started looking at this passage, and they said, wait a minute, there's more to this passage than just Isaiah, or there's more to this passage than just Hezekiah. And I think based on this passage and other passages, they looked back and they said, you know what, this person is still going to come. Okay, and I think out of this passage and others is where they developed the Messiah idea. Okay, because the Messiah concept is not a huge thing in the Old Testament. Okay, for the most part in the Old Testament, they didn't need a Messiah. Okay, because they had the kingdom. Okay, so they didn't need the Messiah. In exile, all of a sudden they say, okay, who's going to bring us back? Who's going to bring us back? Wait a minute, let's go look at this passage. Okay, was Hezekiah truly on the throne from this time forth and forevermore? Was he there all that time? No. No. So I think that even when Isaiah was saying this, he was looking beyond the obvious problem, and he was looking at the real problem. Okay? Somebody needed to bring Israel and Judah back, not militarily, okay? Not economically, but spiritually. And how is that going to happen? Well, there's going to be a son born. And the New Testament writers, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, looked back on this passage and said, this applies to Jesus. And chapter 7 applies to Jesus. This is an explanation of Jesus. So how they could have this interpretation both there, have a meaning there, and in the future. Okay, this double kind of fulfillment. But at the time, Isaiah is telling the people with this particular passage is like, look, Ahaz may not be a great king. Okay, he may be doing things wrong, but we are going to get a king at some point. Looking back, he's doing that. I'm looking back on this. There will be a king that will be amazing, unlike anyone you've ever seen before. Okay, and it's not Hezekiah. Don't think it's Hezekiah. Don't think it's Josiah. It's Jesus. Okay, well, I'm going to finish off there. Thank you very much. Next week, we're going to start into chapter 9, verse 8, which is a poem. It's a 4-stanza poem that ends, each of the stanzas ends like at the end of verse 12. For all this, his anger is not turned away, and his hand is stretched out still. So again, we're back to Isaiah has done this great prophecy of the future. Now we're going to come back and he's going to say, now let's get back to this indictment, what's going on here. So thank you very much for being with me, and I appreciate your time, and I look forward to seeing you next week in June. Summer's coming. Bye now.